There's a couple things that are always worth keeping an eye on when reading an Emily Dickinson poem. Number one is time, especially as it pertains to death, either the specter of death or the very personification thereof. Another thing that is always worth keeping an eye on when you're reading Emily Dickinson is consciousness. Where is the locus of control in the poem? Who is driving the narrative? Where are they? This poem, the poem we will be looking at today, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, contains both of these elements.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. This video is part of 3 separate playlists here on the channel. Number 1 being obviously the Echoes of Emily playlist, but number 2 being a playlist of Emily Dickinson poetry discussions, and third, the general playlist for poetry discussions. If you like or appreciate the work that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing that I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. So consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more literature in the future. Now, there are 5 main talking points that I want to consider with this poem. The first one is, where is our speaker and are they in control? I felt a funeral in my brain and mourners to and fro. Okay, so we're feeling a funeral in the brain, not on the body, in the brain. And mourners to and fro. We cut all the way down to, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. There's not a whole lot to tell us exactly where our speaker finds herself. There's not a whole lot to tell us exactly how literally we are to take this. We're going to get into a little bit of a discussion a couple points from now about what the real meaning of the poem might be. Like, what are we talking about? We're talking about a funeral in the brain, but what are we talking about? Where is the meaning in this poem? But this here, I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. There are 2 possibilities here. Number 1, this is a thing which is happening to our speaker. There is something happening to our speaker, and our speaker is describing that thing as feeling a funeral. Okay, that's one interpretation. Number 2, this could be literal. Our speaker could be trapped inside the brain itself. Now, what does any of this mean? It's hard to say. It is difficult to say. So in that second interpretation there, taking this quite literally,
I felt a funeral from inside my brain. I was inside my brain. I was dead to the world on the without. On the without, that funeral was really a happening. So there is that possibility too here. And in fact, that seems the least likely of the two explanations, except that the rest of the poem is talking about a literal funeral. The number two thing here, I felt a funeral in my brain. Felt is past tense. Our speaker is describing this thing as it had happened. And finished knowing then. Finished knowing then. This, too, is a phrase in the past tense. Everything here has already happened. How much time passes between felt and finished? We can use a little bit of context to assume this is about the time of a funeral, right? We're talking about a funeral. There are mourners to and fro, and finally, our speaker is lowered into the grave. But how much reason do we have to assume that that funeral is literal? If said funeral is not literal, the amount of time between feeling the funeral and our speaker almost expiring, our speaker being disposed, could be gargantuan. If this is something else, in fact, the something else that we will talk about in the next point, that period of time can be years. In fact, this period of time mentioned in this poem, if we are going with a particular metaphor, which you may have already caught on to, could be just the beginning. Indeed, if this is a funeral, funeral is just the beginning of the ever after. It could be that our speaker here is saying these things in the past tense because our speaker here believes herself to have entered the ever after. The ever after meaning everything after this funeral in the brain. That funeral, when you think about it, is a transitional space. You are leaving the world of the living to inhabit the world of the dead. It is the transition from here and now to ever after. That is an interesting thing to consider. Now, how literal is this funeral? Is this a giant symbol for depression? Think of the terms that are often used to describe depression. Powerless. Someone struggling through that feels powerless. They cannot change the world in which they find themselves. Where do we have any locus of control for our speaker? Our speaker here is being acted upon. Hopelessness. Our speaker, where do we get any sign of hope here? Where do we get any sign of aspiration? Where do we have any sign of positivity? Everything just is as it is. Really, there's no sad. There's no happy. Things are just happening.
There is no sad, there is no happy. These things happen, and I am powerless to affect them, and I am hopeless in their presence. Another word or term you often hear is isolation. Everybody dies alone. You've heard that cliche. Our speaker here is certainly alone. Where are our so we're going to get into a little bit of hauntology too. I want to try to bring hauntology and nihilism into at least most of the discussions for this month, but when we talk about estrangement, which is a term that is often used in hauntology, there is still some relation to other people, right? You are estranged. You feel as if someone knows 5% of your life, but you spend 30% of your life with that person. That's sort of estrangement. These people treading to and fro in this poem have zero contact with our speaker. We don't hear them praying for our speaker. We don't hear them eulogizing our speaker. We don't hear anyone crying for our speaker. Our speaker here is completely isolated. And that feeling of sinking. Oftentimes you hear in coordination with discussions about depression, someone feeling as if their world is getting away from them. Someone feeling as if things just keep piling up and I can't ever dig out from under them. I start to work on something and all of a sudden 2 more things pop up, right? It is a feeling of sinking. And then a plank in reason broke. It doesn't matter how hard I work. It doesn't seem to do anything. A plank in reason broke. And I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. So if we decide to allow a reading of this poem that is about depression, let's just think of all the things we know about that affliction and read this one more time. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. That sounds like a pretty strong contender for me. Now, I want to talk about nihilism and I want to talk about hauntology. I felt a funeral in my brain. I have said 1,000,000 times on this channel, Emily Dickinson has some of, if not the very best opening lines and opening couplets in all of literature. I felt a funeral in my brain. One thing, however, that this line does not give us. We have no idea where this funeral, where this feeling in the brain is striking our speaker. Now, there are two types of nihilism. There is strong nihilism, in which what we are saying is, do not take for granted any of the trappings of this world. Nothing that has been is necessarily going to be, right? Nihilism says that, the strong nihilism says that all of the sort of moralities in the world, all of the sort of value systems in the world, they're all made up. You must know that. They're all made up. And if we're going to make them up, you may as well make your own. That's strong nihilism. Weak nihilism, which started to pop up post-World War I, post-World War II. There's a guy called Dmitry Pisarev. There was a guy. He was a Russian. He was one of the original nihilists, and he was a literary critic, etc. One of the things that he said was that here's the ultimatum of our camp, talking about nihilism: strike out right, strike out left. What will fly to smithereens is rubbish. If it breaks down when you question it, it wasn't any good anyhow. If, however, it stands the blow, if you can put your utmost of criticism towards an institution and it stands, okay, maybe it's worth something. It must be good. If you can put your utmost of questioning towards a moral value and belief system, and at the end of the day, that moral value and belief system stands tall, well, I've found it. I've found the moral value and belief system. One of the great big moral value and belief systems in our world is religion. In the wake of World War I and World War II, if you were on those front lines and you found yourself Christian or Jew alike, I'm not sure the participation rate of the Muslim world in World Wars I and II. I honestly have no idea. But we do know that there were so many Christian nations involved, and obviously World War II had a very heavy toll on Judaism. In the wake of those things, that nihilistic temper of, hey, try to tear it down, and if you can tear it down, then it wasn't good anyway. A lot of people looked around in the wake of those wars and said, nothing stood up, man. I was a good, God-fearing person my entire life. That thing happened. Nothing stood up. And now I have to find some way to keep on living. This strain of nihilism is known as weak nihilism. And it says, look, we struck out right. We struck out left. And the whole thing tumbled down. Nothing is worth it. Nothing works. Nothing is standing up to our rigors. I would offer this poem as a weak nihilistic interpretation. Our speaker here is dead, maybe? Our speaker here has felt a funeral in their brain, and if you can wake up tomorrow dead, everything is meaningless. Why would you set aside the fruits of today in order to make tomorrow better if in the meantime you could feel a funeral in your brain and be gone anyhow? It makes no sense. Save no fruit for the morrow. In that way, there is a nihilistic interpretation to be had here. The final thing I want to talk about is hauntology. So, one of the quote-unquote vocabulary words for hauntology is spectrality, which is loosely defined as spectrality refers to the quality of being spectral or ghostly, suggesting a presence that is neither fully present nor entirely absent. Spectrality is a central concept in hauntology, highlighting the ways in which the past manifests as haunting specters in the present. Our speaker here felt a funeral in their brain and is lowered down and finished knowing by the end of this poem. However, in the meantime, there's mourners treading, right? Those are people going around. All those people are seated. The service is beating like a drum. Them lifted a box. All the thems who were present lifted that box and then lowered that box. Our speaker here is spectral, present and not present too, but it seems so. The most haunting thing about this poem is perhaps, though our speaker is the spectral presence, though our speaker seems to be the ghastly, our speaker herself seems to be the ghosty involved in the storytelling, our speaker here does not interact with the people. The people interact with her, at least on a physical level. She can hear them. She feels them lower her into the grave. In this way, they are the mourners themselves. They are the people involved who are perhaps the ghosts in practice. In reality, seems to be our speaker that is the dead one, seems to be our speaker who is the spectral individual. Our speaker is the specter. There's a specter haunting this poem, the specter of speaker. But in practice, in this poem, they are the people, the individuals, the mourners to and fro, who are the specters. They are popping up in our speaker's reality and causing disturbance. This is, if we are to take things on a hauntological level, an extremely interesting twist on the specter versus individual continuum, conundrum, whatever you would call it, casting the living as the specters to the dead is an interesting twist. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then.